The date was January 22nd, 1573. 150 German mercenaries stood on the frozen walls of Weissenstein Castle, watching an army that stretched to the horizon. 18,000 Russian soldiers surrounded their fortress, their war banners snapping in the bitter wind. Behind them rolled siege cannons, supply wagons, and enough provisions to sustain a campaign for months. At the head of this overwhelming force rode Tsar Ivan IV, a man history would remember as Ivan the Terrible, who'd promised to crucify every defender when the castle fell. The garrison commander did the math. 120 to 1 odds. No reinforcements coming. Supplies running low. Temperatures dropping to deadly levels every night. Every military calculation said this siege would be over in days, maybe a week if they were lucky. But those German mercenaries had something Ivan hadn't counted on. They were Landsknechts, professional soldiers who'd made a career of defending impossible positions. And over the next 31 days, they would teach the Tsar of Russia that sometimes sheer stubbornness and tactical brilliance can overcome numbers that should guarantee annihilation. To understand why this siege seems so hopelessly one-sided, you need to grasp exactly what Ivan the Terrible brought to Weissenstein in 1573. This wasn't just another medieval army. This was the military machine of the largest country in Europe, led by a ruler whose very name inspired terror across the continent. Ivan had spent 2 decades building something unprecedented in Russian history, a centralized autocracy backed by overwhelming military force. His Oprichniki, a personal guard of 6,000 fanatically loyal warriors, enforced his will with systematic brutality. Towns that resisted saw their population slaughtered. Nobles who questioned his authority were tortured publicly. Ivan didn't just defeat his enemies. He erased them as warnings to others. But the numbers tell only part of Ivan's story. By 1573, he'd been fighting the Livonian War for 15 years, a brutal campaign to give Russia access to Baltic trade routes and European markets. He'd conquered fortress after fortress, broken army after army, and established Russian dominance over territories that had resisted Moscow for centuries. His siege tactics combined Russian manpower with Western European technology. Heavy cannons purchased from German foundries. Engineers trained in the latest fortification techniques. A logistics system capable of keeping massive armies supplied through the worst winter conditions imaginable. When Ivan's army arrived at your walls, history suggested you had 2 choices. Surrender immediately and hope for mercy, or resist and watch your entire garrison crucified once the walls fell. Those weren't theoretical threats. Ivan had demonstrated his methods dozens of times. At the Siege of Polotsk, defenders who held out too long were impaled on stakes surrounding the city. At Novgorod, he'd orchestrated a massacre that killed thousands simply on suspicion of disloyalty. Weissenstein Castle was all that stood between Ivan and complete control of northern Livonia. The fortress sat on a strategic position controlling key trade routes, and its fall would open the path to the Baltic coast. But here's what made this siege personal for Ivan. Weissenstein wasn't held by local defenders or feudal knights. It was garrisoned by German Landsknechts fighting for Sweden, Ivan's primary rival in the region. These weren't conscripted peasants or honor-bound nobles. They were professional soldiers who fought for pay and reputation. And they'd already humiliated Russian forces once before in a skirmish near the castle walls. For Ivan, a man who saw defiance as personal insult requiring brutal response, Weissenstein had to fall, and fall hard. The Landsknechts represented something entirely different from typical medieval soldiers. These weren't farmers called to war during planting season or knights fighting for feudal obligation. They were full-time professional warriors who turned warfare into a business. Recruited from the German-speaking lands of Central Europe, Landsknechts sold their services to whoever paid best. But calling them mercenaries doesn't capture what made them special. They operated under a strict code called the Article Brief that governed everything from pay distribution to battlefield conduct. Betray that code and your own company would execute you. Fight with honor and skill, and you'd earn enough to retire wealthy if you survived. Here's what made Landsknechts so effective in defensive situations. Unlike armies built around cavalry charges or archery volleys, Landsknechts specialized in close-quarters combat using pikes, halberds, and two-handed swords. They trained constantly in formation fighting, where individual units moved like single organisms. Most crucially, They developed defensive tactics specifically designed to hold fortifications against superior numbers. These weren't theories learned from books. Every Landsknecht in Weissenstein had survived previous sieges. They knew exactly how attackers thought, where defenses were weakest, and how to maximize every advantage a fortress provided. The garrison commander at Weissenstein was a veteran named Jürgen von Ferensbach, though some sources suggest it may have been another German officer whose name was lost to history. What's certain is that whoever commanded those 150 men understood the mathematics of siege warfare better than most generals of his era. He knew that 18,000 attackers should overwhelm 150 defenders in days. But he also knew something Ivan probably didn't fully appreciate. Castle defenses weren't about matching numbers. They were about force multiplication. One man on a wall with a crossbow could hold off 10 attackers trying to climb ladders. One cannon firing down from battlements could break formations of hundreds. One well-timed sortie could destroy siege equipment that took weeks to build. When Ivan's army arrived on January 22nd, they found Weissenstein prepared for exactly this moment. The fortress sat on elevated ground, its walls recently reinforced with earthworks that could absorb cannon fire. The garrison had stockpiled ammunition, food, and medical supplies. More importantly, they'd prepared psychological defenses. When Ivan sent his standard demand for surrender, offering safe passage if the garrison yielded immediately, the Landsknechts responded by hanging the messenger's white flag from the walls upside down. The message was clear: we're not surrendering. Come and take this castle if you can. Here's what made that refusal so strategically sound. The Landsknechts knew something about winter siege warfare that Ivan's generals probably underestimated. Attacking a prepared fortress in January meant the besiegers would suffer more than the besieged. Russian soldiers would spend weeks camped in open fields where temperatures dropped below freezing every night. They'd need constant supplies of firewood, food, and fresh water. Frostbite, disease, and exposure would kill more men than combat. Meanwhile, the defenders had shelter, stored provisions, and the ability to choose when and where to fight. Time wasn't on Ivan's side despite his overwhelming numbers. Every day the siege continued cost him resources and momentum. But Ivan hadn't brought 18,000 men just for show. He ordered his engineers to begin siege operations immediately. Work crews started building wooden siege towers despite the frozen ground, making construction difficult. Artillery positions were established on 3 sides of the castle, heavy cannons that could potentially breach the walls given enough time. Infantry units rotated through assault positions, keeping constant pressure on the defenders. The Tsar wanted this fortress broken quickly, before word spread that a handful of German mercenaries were defying his might. His reputation demanded swift, brutal victory. The Landsknechts had other plans. They'd survived impossible sieges before. They'd held walls against armies that should have overwhelmed them. And they were about to demonstrate that in winter warfare, determination and tactical expertise could defy mathematics that seemed absolute. What happened over the next 31 days would become legendary among military professionals across Europe. A masterclass in defensive warfare that military academies would study for centuries. The first Russian assault came on January 24th, just 2 days into the siege. Ivan wasn't interested in slow starvation tactics. He wanted Weissenstein broken immediately, both to secure the strategic position and to demonstrate what happened to those who defied him. His engineers had worked through 2 nights in sub-zero temperatures to position siege ladders and construct covered approaches to the walls. At dawn, waves of Russian infantry advanced toward the fortress, their boots crunching through snow that had fallen overnight. The Landsknechts watched them come with professional calculation. They'd seen this pattern before. Here's what made the first assault so revealing. Ivan's forces had numbers and courage, but they lacked the specialized training for winter siege warfare. Soldiers carrying heavy ladders through deep snow tired quickly. Frozen fingers struggled to grip weapons effectively. The covered approaches that worked well in summer became death traps when defenders dropped heated stones that melted through wooden roofs. As Russian troops reached the walls and began raising ladders, the Landsknechts demonstrated exactly why professional soldiers earned their reputation. They didn't panic or waste ammunition. Each defender had a designated section of wall and specific responsibilities. Crossbowmen picked off ladder carriers before they reached the walls. Pikemen waited until attackers climbed high enough that pushing the ladders away sent them falling onto their comrades below. The few Russians who made it onto the battlements found themselves facing lance-necked two-handed swords in confined spaces where Russian numbers meant nothing. The assault lasted 3 hours before Russian commanders called retreat. They'd lost over 200 men. The Landsknechts had lost 4. But here's what troubled Ivan's generals more than the casualties. The defenders hadn't just repelled the attack. They'd made it look easy. Professional, coordinated, efficient. This wasn't desperate resistance. This was practiced expertise. If a major assault with thousands of troops couldn't break 150 men, what would? The answer, Ivan's siege engineers decided, was artillery. The heavy cannons they'd dragged across frozen terrain were designed to crack castle walls like eggshells. For the next week, Russian guns pounded Weissenstein with systematic precision. 24-pound iron balls smashed into stone fortifications. The constant barrage was meant to do more than just damage walls. It was psychological warfare. The noise alone was maddening. Explosions every few minutes, day and night, made sleep impossible. Defenders had to constantly watch for breaches while stone fragments and shrapnel turned sections of the fortress into kill zones. But the Landsknechts had prepared for exactly this scenario. Behind the main walls, they'd constructed secondary earthwork barriers that could absorb cannonballs that breached the outer defenses. They rotated men through the most dangerous positions so no one stayed in high-risk areas long enough to crack under the strain. Most cleverly, they'd identified the Russian artillery positions and prepared counter-battery fire using the castle's own smaller cannons. Every time Russian guns fired, Landsknecht artillery spotters calculated trajectories and directed return fire at the enemy positions. They couldn't match the Russians gun for gun, but they could make operating those siege cannons dangerous and exhausting work. Here's where winter became the defender's secret weapon. While the Landsknechts had shelter, Russian artillerymen worked in open positions exposed to winds that dropped temperatures to deadly levels. Gun crews had to keep fires burning constantly to prevent metal components from becoming too brittle. Black powder had to be kept dry despite snow and freezing rain. Worst of all, the ground was so frozen that recoil from firing cannons shifted gun positions, requiring constant realignment. What should have been a week of overwhelming bombardment turned into a grinding war of attrition where the Russians suffered more casualties from frostbite than from enemy fire. By early February, Ivan's patience was wearing thin. His army had been camped outside Weissenstein for 2 weeks, and the fortress showed no signs of imminent collapse. Supply wagons struggled through snow-clogged roads. Soldiers huddled in inadequate shelters. Disease was spreading through the camps as cramped. Cold conditions created perfect breeding grounds for illness. The Tsar ordered a new strategy. If direct assault and bombardment weren't working, they'd try mining. Russian engineers began digging tunnels under the frozen ground, planning to collapse sections of wall by detonating explosives beneath the foundations. It was brutal, dangerous work. Miners had to break through earth that was frozen solid for the first several feet. They worked in darkness, always aware that if defenders detected the tunnels, they'd be buried alive. But the Landsknechts knew about mining operations. It was one of the oldest siege tactics, and experienced defenders developed techniques to counter it. They placed bowls of water on the ground inside the fortress and watched for ripples that indicated digging nearby. They conducted their own counter-mining operations, digging down to intercept Russian tunnels before they could reach critical positions. When Landsknecht miners broke through into a Russian tunnel on February 8th, the resulting underground battle was savage and claustrophobic. Fighting with knives and short swords in spaces so confined that men couldn't swing weapons properly. The Germans drove the Russians back, then collapsed both tunnels to prevent further mining attempts in that sector. Here's what made the defenders' resistance so psychologically devastating for Ivan's forces. Every failed assault, every repelled attack, every thwarted siege tactic reinforced the same message. These 150 men couldn't be broken by conventional means. Russian soldiers began whispering that the Landsknechts were supernatural, protected by dark magic. Officers executed men for spreading such talk, but the rumors persisted. Morale was crumbling despite overwhelming numerical superiority. Meanwhile, inside Weissenstein, the Landsknechts maintained discipline through professional routine. Morning inspections, regular drills, careful rationing of supplies. The garrison commander knew that psychological endurance was as important as physical defense. Keep the men focused on their duties, maintain the illusion of normality, and prevent the kind of despair that led to surrender discussions. But the siege was taking its toll. By mid-February, the garrison had lost 30 men, mostly to accidents and disease rather than combat. A quarter of their original force gone. Ammunition was running low. Food supplies that should have lasted 2 months were being consumed faster than planned because the brutal cold forced men to eat more just to maintain body heat. Medical supplies were nearly exhausted, and wounds that would heal easily in warmer conditions festered in the cold. The Landsknechts were winning every tactical engagement, but they were slowly losing the war of attrition. Ivan sensed this vulnerability. On February 15th, he ordered the largest assault yet. Every available soldier, nearly 15,000 men, would attack simultaneously from all sides. The plan was simple and brutal. Overwhelm the defenders through sheer numbers. Even professional soldiers couldn't be everywhere at once. Somebody would break through. Once inside the walls, Russian numerical superiority would become decisive. The assault began at dawn. Thousands of soldiers surged toward Weissenstein's walls carrying ladders, grappling hooks, and siege towers that had been constructed specifically for this moment. The noise was incredible. War drums, horns, thousands of voices raised in battle cries. The Landsknechts watched the approaching horde with grim determination. This was the moment that would determine everything. The garrison commander made a decision that violated every principle of siege defense. Instead of staying behind the walls and repelling attacks, he ordered a sortie. 50 men, a third of his remaining effective force, would sally out through a hidden gate and attack the Russian siege equipment while the assault was in progress. It was insane. Outnumbered 300 to 1, operating in open ground where their defensive advantages disappeared. But the commander understood something crucial about mob psychology. An army focused on assault doesn't expect to be attacked from behind. The sortie erupted from Weissenstein's gates like a thunderbolt. 50 Landsknechts in tight formation crashed into the rear of the Russian forces, targeting the siege towers that were slowly advancing toward the walls. They moved with surgical precision, setting fire to wooden structures, killing engineers, and creating chaos in areas where Russian commanders thought they were safe. The psychological impact was devastating. Russian troops at the rear, thinking they were in secure positions, suddenly found themselves in desperate combat. Officers tried to redirect forces to counter the sortie, but that meant pulling men away from the main assault. The attack that should have been overwhelming and coordinated fragmented into confused local battles. Meanwhile, on the walls, the remaining 100 Landsknechts fought with desperate intensity. They knew their comrades outside the walls were doomed unless the sortie could withdraw quickly. They had to hold every ladder, every position, every foot of wall, or the entire defense would collapse. For 2 hours, the battle raged with savage intensity. Russian soldiers died by the hundreds on the ladders and walls. The sortie force, having destroyed 3 siege towers and killed dozens of engineers, fought their way back toward the gates through a corridor of Russian troops. They lost half their number in the withdrawal, 25 men who sold their lives to buy time for their comrades to reach safety. But they made it back. The gates slammed shut, and Ivan's grand assault, which should have overwhelmed the fortress through pure numbers, had failed. Russian casualties exceeded 800 men. The Landsknechts had lost 53 total, most from the sortie. The math still favored Ivan. But mathematics wasn't winning this siege. Skill, determination, and tactical brilliance were. And the Landsknechts had those advantages in abundance. After the failed assault of February 15th, something shifted in the Russian camp. Ivan the Terrible, a man who'd built his reputation on crushing resistance and terrorizing enemies into submission, found himself facing a problem that brute force couldn't solve. His army had been besieging Weissenstein for nearly a month. Thousands of his soldiers were dead, wounded, or incapacitated by disease and frostbite. The fortress showed no signs of surrender. And every day this siege continued. Word spread across Europe that a handful of German mercenaries were defying the Tsar of Russia. For a ruler whose power rested on the perception of invincibility, this was more than a military setback. It was a political disaster. Ivan's generals presented him with the brutal mathematics. Continuing the siege would require at least another month, possibly 2, to starve the defenders into submission. During that time, they'd lose hundreds more men to the cold and disease. Supply lines were stretched to breaking point. Other fortresses in the region, seeing Weissenstein's resistance, might be emboldened to resist as well. The strategic calculation that had made capturing this castle essential in January now looked different in late February. Was one fortress worth the cost of thousands of casualties and a damaged reputation? But here's what made Ivan's decision so psychologically complex. He was called the Terrible for a reason. Abandoning a siege meant admitting defeat. It meant 150 mercenaries had successfully defied him. It meant every future enemy would remember that overwhelming force wasn't enough to break determined resistance. For a man who'd ordered the massacre of entire cities for lesser defiance, walking away from Weissenstein required swallowing more pride than most rulers could manage. Inside the fortress, the Landsknechts faced their own crisis. By late February, they were down to fewer than 100 effective fighters. Ammunition was critically low. Food supplies were nearly exhausted. The brutal cold had taken a toll that combat never could, with men suffering from frostbite, respiratory infections, and sheer exhaustion. The garrison commander knew they couldn't hold out much longer. Maybe another week if they were lucky. But he also knew something that Ivan couldn't see from outside the walls. The Russians were breaking. He could see it in the way their assaults had become less coordinated, less determined. He could hear it in the reduced artillery fire, suggesting either ammunition shortages or demoralized gun crews. Most tellingly, Russian desertions had increased dramatically. His scouts reported finding frozen bodies in the snow, Russian soldiers who tried to flee the siege and died in the attempt. On February 21st, something unprecedented happened. A Russian officer approached Weissenstein under a white flag, not with a demand for surrender, but with a proposal. Ivan was willing to lift the siege if the garrison would agree to evacuate the fortress and march out with honors of war. They could keep their weapons, their personal belongings, and their lives. In return, they'd leave Weissenstein to Russian occupation and not return to fight in this region. It was the kind of negotiated settlement that sieges sometimes ended with when both sides recognized that continued fighting served no one's interests. The garrison commander called his officers together to discuss the offer. They'd held out for a month against impossible odds. They'd inflicted devastating casualties on a vastly superior force. But they were exhausted, running out of supplies, and couldn't possibly last another full siege assault. Every military calculation said accept the terms. Take the victory they'd earned and live to fight another day. Here's where the story takes a turn that reveals something profound about professional soldiers and their understanding of warfare's psychological dimensions. The Landsknechts refused the offer, not because they thought they could hold out indefinitely, but because they recognized what Ivan's proposal really meant. The Tsar was offering terms because he needed to leave before his army disintegrated completely. If the Russians were truly winning, they'd never negotiate. The fact that Ivan was willing to let them walk away meant he'd already lost, even if he hadn't admitted it yet. Accepting the offer would give Ivan a face-saving exit. Refusing it would force him to either commit to a siege he couldn't win or abandon the effort entirely with no concessions to show for his losses. The garrison commander sent back a simple message. Weissenstein would negotiate only with Swedish forces, the power that held ultimate authority over the region. Ivan's jurisdiction wasn't recognized. It was a diplomatic middle finger disguised as a procedural objection. More importantly, it bought time. Swedish reinforcements were reportedly moving through the region, though whether they'd arrive before the garrison collapsed was anyone's guess. The gamble was insane. They were calling Ivan's bluff with almost no cards left to play. But sometimes in warfare, perception matters more than reality. And the Landsknechts bet everything that Ivan couldn't afford to look weak. For 3 more days, the siege continued in a strange stalemate. Russian forces maintained their positions but launched no major assaults. Artillery fire slowed to sporadic shots that seemed more like displays of presence than serious attacks. Inside Weissenstein, the defenders rationed their last supplies and prepared for either relief or a final desperate stand. Then, on February 24th, 31 days after the siege began, Russian forces began withdrawing. Not in panicked retreat, but in organized columns that suggested planned withdrawal rather than defeat. Ivan's engineers destroyed their own siege equipment rather than leave it for the defenders. Supply wagons rolled back toward Russian-controlled territory. By sunset, The army that had surrounded Weissenstein with overwhelming force had vanished into the winter landscape. The Landsknechts had won. 150 German mercenaries, reduced to fewer than 100 effectives by the siege's end, had forced Ivan the Terrible to abandon his attack. They'd inflicted thousands of casualties, destroyed siege equipment worth a fortune, and held a strategically vital fortress against odds that should have guaranteed their annihilation. But here's what made their victory so significant beyond the immediate tactical success. They'd broken the psychological weapon that made Ivan so effective: the perception of invincibility. For 2 decades, Ivan's reputation had been his greatest asset. Cities surrendered at the mere approach of his armies because everyone knew resistance meant destruction. Weissenstein proved that wasn't true. Skilled defenders in prepared positions could defy even the Tsar of Russia. That psychological shift rippled through the Livonian War immediately. Other fortresses that had been preparing to surrender when Russian forces approached suddenly found courage to resist. Swedish commanders who'd been considering abandoning their positions in northern Livonia decided to hold their ground. Local populations that had accepted Russian occupation began organizing resistance. The siege that was supposed to demonstrate Ivan's power had done the opposite. It revealed his limitations. More importantly, Weissenstein demonstrated something about siege warfare that would influence military thinking for generations. Numbers alone don't determine outcomes. Professional soldiers with superior training and tactical expertise can hold fortified positions against forces 10, 20, even 100 times their size if they understand the principles of defensive warfare. The Landsknechts hadn't just gotten lucky. They'd executed a masterclass in how to turn a fortress into a force multiplier. The strategic implications extended beyond the immediate war. Ivan's failure at Weissenstein contributed to the eventual stalemate in the Livonian War. He'd invested 15 years and enormous resources trying to secure Baltic access, but sieges like Weissenstein bled his forces without delivering decisive victories. By 1583, Russia would sign peace treaties that ended the war without achieving Ivan's primary objectives. The Tsar, who de-terrorized his own nobility and crushed internal dissent, couldn't overcome the basic military reality that professional defenders in strong positions are nearly impossible to defeat through force alone. For the Landsknechts, Weissenstein became legendary. Stories of the siege spread through military communities across Europe. German mercenary companies used it as a recruiting tool. Pay us to defend your fortresses, and we'll hold them against any force, just like at Weissenstein. The siege became required study in military academies, analyzed for its lessons on defensive tactics, morale maintenance under extreme conditions, and the psychology of siege warfare. But perhaps the most important lesson from Weissenstein wasn't tactical. It was about the nature of military reputation and psychological warfare. Ivan had built his power on fear, on the perception that resistance was futile. The Landsknechts proved that reputation alone doesn't win battles. Skill wins battles. Preparation wins battles. Determination wins battles. And sometimes, a small group of professionals who refuse to accept defeat can accomplish what entire armies cannot. The siege also revealed something about the limits of autocratic military power. Ivan commanded massive resources and could order thousands of men to their deaths without accountability. But he couldn't order those men to succeed against prepared defenders who understood their craft better than his generals understood siege warfare. Centralized authority is powerful, but it can't substitute for tactical expertise and professional competence. February 24th, 1573 marked the day that 150 German mercenaries taught the most feared ruler in Europe that sometimes numbers don't matter. That professional soldiers defending prepared positions can defy mathematics that seem absolute. That reputation and terror are powerful weapons until they meet someone who refuses to be intimidated. Ivan the Terrible would continue his reign for another 11 years, but he never again attempted to besiege a fortress held by Landsknechts. The lesson learned at Weissenstein was too expensive to repeat. As for the defenders themselves, most survived to fight in other campaigns. Some retired on the bonuses earned from their successful defense. Others continued their careers as professional soldiers, trading on the reputation earned during those 31 frozen days. Their names are mostly forgotten by history, but their achievement remains. They held the walls when every rational calculation said those walls would fall. They refused to surrender when surrender was the only logical option. And they prove that in warfare, courage and competence can sometimes overcome odds that mathematics says are impossible. Subscribe for more battles where brilliant defensive strategy and sheer determination defeated overwhelming force and changed the course of wars.